important book put out by the Asian Development Bank in early 2020. I think this is a book that's gonna stand the test of time. Former president of the Asian Development Bank, President Nakao, was the person that, in essence, commissioned the book and played a very active role in helping make it possible. But the book was the work of many, many contributors and authors. There are many chapters. It's very detailed. It took over almost 3 years to put this book together. And so we're going to have a conversation about this book and some of the lessons learned about development in Asia. And this is really, I think, going to be a very, very interesting conversation. I've been looking forward to this a long time. I did read the whole thing. It's more than 530 pages. And it was sort of my COVID lockdown companion book for several months. But it's been an excellent, excellent book. It's a very important book. And this is going to be a book that's consulted 20 years from now. Again, the book is Asia's Journey to Prosperity. Now, I know we have a number of great panelists after President Nakao who are going to join us. We have my friend Ambassador Cinnamon Dornsife, who was the former U.S. Executive Director of the Asian Development Bank in the Clinton administration. We have Dr. Chatib Basri, who was a former Finance Minister of Indonesia. Thank you, Dr. Basri. We also have Dr. Hal Hill, who's an academic from Australia, but is also closely associated with the Asian Development Bank and is an expert on Southeast Asia. So we've got some really thoughtful people to help us unpack a really big topic, but a really important topic. So thank you, panelists, for doing that. And I'm going to ask President Nakao if he could join me and virtually to have a conversation about this book. President Nakao, what a pleasure to have you. Congratulations on this book.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm very happy that you had the time to read it and found this book very good, partly because of the COVID issue. So it is really nice. And I have so many good friends as a panelist. I didn't choose it, by the way, but I hope that they will make a very good contribution to this event.
So President Nakao, let's get right into it. Why did the Asian Development Bank, the team of many authors, put this book together, Asia's Journey to Prosperity, Policy, Market, and Technology? Tell me why.
Yeah, because we published a book about Asian Development Bank history. The bank history is from the beginning of 1966. And at that moment already, some staff had an idea of having a twin book of history of Asian development. And there were so many discussions about what is the focus and what should be included. Like gender was a part of inclusive growth in the beginning, but I said it should be separate chapter.
There's
and
also,
and also, okay, down a little bit. There was some, and also I wanted to emphasize the importance of market and also the technologies. And often Asian development is associated with strong guidance by the state, but I think we should emphasize the importance of the market and trade and investment so on, much more than many, especially the Westerners, believe. That is my idea.
So President Nakao, I think you had some slides you wanted to share. Maybe you might share some slides, President Nakao.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll share this one, and this is a table of contents, and you can see that there are 15 chapters, and the first chapter is a kind of summary, and it discusses that the Asian per capita GDP from 1960 to 2018 was 15 times as much, and in case of China, it was 40 times as much. And the first chapter is like a role of the markets, state, and institutions. And here we discussed that the market is important, and it plays an important role of dynamic development of countries, and import substitutions or central planning didn't work at all. But the state also had a very important role of the setting institutions for the development, including education, health, and also the commerce law and the systems of central banks and banks and so on. So of course, state is important, but the market plays a key role, and many countries started growing, especially, for instance, China. After opening up and reform, they started developing, and also Indonesia, there was more influence from socialist idea, state-owned companies. But after they started opening up and reforming to the market-oriented policies, they started growing very solidly. And then dynamics of structural transformation is of course important. And by the way, this book is in a sense a kind of the revisiting Asian histories from the World Bank publications of East Asian Miracle. And as it is clear that we cover, by the way, I'm sorry that I'm moving around, but it covers all Asian developing member countries, and sometimes it refers to Japan, Australia, New Zealand, which were never the developing country status. They never borrowed, but we discussed Australia and Japan from time to time, especially Japan, because it is a kind of a model for many Asian countries. And yeah, I'd like to show that the Asians, developing Asia's share in GDP of the world is now much larger, 24%, and compared to just 4%. And of course, the growth of China played a very important role. I would like to show this charts all together very quickly, and the contributions of the factors. Capital input was very important in 1970s and 85, and total factor productivity gain is negative. And I think it is because, partly because technology development is incorporated capital input as a more sophisticated input, and it is pricey, so it is more input from capital, but in reality, it incorporates more technologies. And then from 1995 on, there was more contributions from the TFP, and in 2010 to 2017, total factor productivity, which cannot be explained by the input of capital, labor, and human capital, which is like education, is becoming larger share. And so these are things I wanted to show. So, and table of contents again. So dynamics of structural transformation from agriculture society to industry and service. And in many countries, services become very important, including sophisticated service sectors like business process outsourcing in India and the Philippines. For instance, in Manila, when I lived there, I saw many, many business process outsourcing companies surrounding my apartment in the center of a modern city. And 10% of GDP comes from such industries of IT. So service is important, and service is becoming more tradable. And that is very interesting because of IT and internet digital technology. And agriculture's green revolution was a very important starting point of development. And there were so many contributions from Ford foundations for rice and so on, and also IRI, which is an international rice institute in Philippines. And technological progress, I wanted to stress the importance of technological progress, partly because Professor Krugman said as if Asia's growth was based on the just resource mobilizations of labor and capital. But the first, mobilizing capital and labor efficiently to the production is such an achievement, which many countries outside Asia didn't really achieve, including, for instance, Africa. But in addition, if these input are used, then there will be more dependence on technology, and endogenous technology can develop. And that's what we wanted to stress. And I already showed the importance of total factor productivity. And education and health and the demography, this is really important. And especially education, there was a much gain of the education years. And in Bangladesh, for instance, there was only 0.2 years of education for women and zero point 0.8 year in 1960. So on average, many people didn't have any formal education, but today they have about 9 years, and women's education in many countries in Bangladesh is longer. And I think this kind of fact is very important, isn't it? And people start regarding women's health education is important for investment because there is a gain by working in the garment industry, for instance. And also, many countries all countries regard education as a right of the people to make people's life more rich and empowered and also happy. So education and health are important factor of the human capital, but it is also the purpose of the society, isn't it? So, and also demographic changes. Many countries enjoy the demographic bonus or dividend, but now they are starting having demographic bonus because of lower fertility rate. And women don't have a baby, or couples don't have as many babies as before. And there are many reasons, including departure from traditional values. Women start working, and also there are less death of kids, and so they don't need to have more babies. It's very good. And also there are more cost for education and so on. So there are many reasons that societies have lower numbers of kids, and it has a kind of a very big impact in the beginning, demographic dividend, and then it will be aging and declining population, which is really the first event in the human history. Isn't it such a big trend of a declining population, except the time of a plague and so on. There were such a time of a pandemic, but it was not constant declining of population, but we are facing it. And the importance of investment, saving, and finance, and especially in Asia, we have a more bank-based finance, which is not bad, but we need to promote capital-based, this securities-based kind of intermediation. And then infrastructure development. Toward the end, I found that we didn't have such discussions about railways and road and powers, electric powers and urban system and so on. Although we had a discussion about the investment, but because the bank is focused on these infrastructure development, especially in early days, it's nice to have such sections about what are the power transitions, and there was motorization, and then we are coming back to more urban public transportation system. So it's very nice to see the history of power, and electricity was first produced in hydro energies in Kyoto in the end of the 19th century, and there was also Bombay and Shanghai, there were power stations around that time. By the UK, there was first power stations in India around 1900. Trade, foreign direct investment, and the OPLES. There is no question that these are the most important element of Asian development, and many Asian countries, including China and India and others, had more or less, especially China, because of social system, they had import substitutions and central planning state-owned companies and so on to have a more kind of speedy industrializations, especially for heavy industry, chemical and heavy. But it was total failure. Like in Latin America, they had to import the technologies and capital goods anyway. So in the end, because they couldn't export many, there is even the balance of payments crisis in many countries. But after several years, 1 or 2 decades, Asian countries started orienting the export import substitutions, and it started from maybe Japan and needs countries, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and Taipei, China. But other countries followed, very importantly, China. And then around 90, India, and Indonesia also started liberalizing system. So this is really important element of Asia. And macroeconomic stability, especially after Asian financial crisis, central bank independence and more, solid fiscal policies, and the banking system is reinforced and so on. So this is an important element in Asian development compared to Latin America. And poverty reduction, income distribution is also interesting. Like Kuznets U curve, there was a reverse U curve. There is a growing, income disequalities, and then it will come down. But in reality, because of globalizations and because of technologies, now we have a more income inequalities and asset inequalities in many countries, including in developed countries, but also in developing countries, because of the skilled workers can gain more, and the capitalists can gain more because of partnership with the foreign direct investment and so on. Although public reduction has made serious progress, and in India and China and other countries, absolute poverty is almost becoming eliminated. But if we use a little bit more reasonable income, we still have a lot of poverty. And gender development is so interesting because, as I said, women's educations have made a serious progress, and in many countries, they get more education than men. I think partly because sons and men are expected to work for the family business. And so women are more educated, and I teach at schools, and women students are usually more serious and studying hard. So I shouldn't have a sexist, but it's very nice to see those development. And also women health, maternal health is so improved. That is one of the reasons for life expectancy. By the way, average life expectancy was extended from about 45 years in 1960 to 70 something in 2018, partly because of the antibiotics, and but clean water was very important, and also the delivery help for women was very important to avoid the maternal fatality, and also infant death was very rapidly improved. So the remaining challenges are in non-communicable diseases, which is very costly because we must have more care for cancers and hypertension and so on, and it takes more time compared to the diarrhea, for instance. And the environment and the sustainability, climate change, and this is a very important issues for the world, and Asia is grow fast and clean later, but in many other countries. But they start paying more attention to environmental issues, and also they want to be a part of a Paris Agreement and other initiatives for the mitigations and adaptations of climate change. They are very serious, and China is serious about using carbon pricing and so on. So, and then bilateral multilateral development finance, including from ADB and the World Bank and other countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Korea today. Those are very important. And also there is an emerging donor or financier like AIIB or China. And the regional corporations, including in ASEAN, is such important. I think ASEAN is a great achievement because they started as a kind of defense against the intrusions of communists, but now they include Vietnam, Cambodia, and other countries which are not part of the system, but they provide the friendship and the cooperations, and also the trade integration, investment integrations, and also they pursued good policies altogether. Singapore's may played an important role, but also it sets a kind of a platform to the ASEAN plus 3 Chiang Mai Initiative or ASEAN plus 6 RCEP trade arrangement, and the headquarters is in Indonesia. So I think ASEAN is a very successful case of regional cooperation. It's not like EU, or euro, but I think this kind of framework, soft framework is really contributing. I spoke too much because I have this table of contents, but there are so many interesting topics. I couldn't go into the detail, but each chapter has so many narrative or stories of interesting things. I wanted to make this book very readable and also interesting. Sorry that I spoke too much.
President Nakao, I think it's a very interesting book. And I can tell you're very enthusiastic about it, so I didn't want to interrupt you. I have one more question for you in our time together. You talk about in this book that there is no such thing as an Asian consensus. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, because there is a discussion, because of the China's rise as economic power or industry power, there is a discussion that there can be different kind of capitalism. And some people in China start saying Beijing consensus, and that is different from the Washington consensus. But to me, what they did after reform and opening up is more like the Washington consensus. Of course, they took a more pragmatic approach, like special economic zone in the beginning and responsible the production system in farming and industries in the beginning. So they were more pragmatic and gradual. It's not the big bang, but they are essentially not so different from Washington consensus. Many Americans or Europeans tend to regard the Asian growth more based on the state guidance, but strong state guidance is often failure. By the way, can you see my face? Because your face is in the center.
I can see your face, and
Okay.
so you're okay. I'm okay.
Yeah, okay.
You're okay.
Okay.
Okay. So what are the couple of big messages? You wrote this book for a reason. I think you wanted to update you. There were a lot to say. That the Asian journey to prosperity is real. There were a series of reasons why. You've gone through them. The progress in Asia has been unbelievable. It's sort of world record progress in those 50 years. What are there a couple of messages you want to leave behind from this book? What are the big messages, short, President Nakao, what are the short, big messages you want to leave behind from this book?
Yeah, okay, so they grew very much, very fast. The second, there was no particular secret to Asian growth. It is based on the standard approach in the end. And also the third is countries are different between each other, although there is a commonalities. And Japan's, for instance, modernization started much earlier. And so it's different, but that is another point. And also there is too much emphasis of export-oriented economies. And as I said, export was needed to import things. And in case of Japan, until 1960s, mid 1960s, it suffered from a balance of account, balance of current balance of balance of payment until mid 1960s, because they had to import a lot of things like oil and technologies, parts and so on. So export oriented should be regarded as a kind of external or outward oriented instead of import substitutions. And also technology is important, and it is also burgeoning in Asia instead of just buying from the West. So those are important messages.
Excellent. Thank you, President Nakao. Let me turn to the panel. I want to bring in our panelists, and then I'm going to bring you back into the conversation, President Nakao. But I'm so pleased to have this really interesting set of panelists. So I have my friend, Ambassador Cinnamon Dornsife, as I said, was ambassador to the Asian Development Bank in the Clinton administration. We have Dr. Basri, who was finance minister of Indonesia, and we have Mr. Hal Hill. Thank you, Hal. Good day, Hal. And he's an academic from Australia, but an expert on Southeast Asia, and was one of the heavily involved in the writing of this book. So let me start, Hal, let me start with you actually, because you were one of the authors of this book. Could you talk about how this was, oh my goodness, how this was put together, Hal? Put yourself off of mute if you would, Hal.
Yes. Well, good morning from Canberra, Dan.
Great, good morning.
Good evening over there, and to Nakao-san and my eminent friend in Jakarta and the other panelists. I'm delighted to be here. This is a very important occasion for, I think, as you said, a wonderful book, a defining book. I should emphasize, I was quite involved with this project, but as an editorial advisor. I wasn't a drafter. I read all the drafts as they were in process. As I think Nakao-san and you said, Dan, this was a project which extended over 3 years. So I had the pleasure of reading the drafts and commenting on them quite extensively, but I wasn't primarily a drafter. But I feel quite intimately involved with the volume because I think it's a very fine volume.
So Hal, what if you were what is the one or two big messages you think should take away from this book? Like, what are one of the two lessons about Asian development we should take away from this book, Hal?
Well, I think it's very good to focus on the key lessons because there is so much in it, and that it's important just to focus on the key points. First point, and it's really consistent with what Nakao-san had said earlier. First point is this dramatic change over 50 years in the Asia-Pacific economies. It's worth just remembering back in the 1960s, almost all of Asia, except for Japan, was extremely poor. China was not part of the global economy. India was locked into the so-called Hindu equilibrium of almost stagnant growth. Indonesia had not had a rise in per capita income for over 50 years. East Asia was increasingly dominated by the Vietnam-Indochina War. So things were exceptionally gloomy at that time. Most of Asia was in fact poorer than sub-Saharan Africa. So the key takeaway, I think, is this dramatic transformation. It's summarized very clearly in table 1.1 of the book. And that shows how Asia Pacific has grown a lot faster than the rest of the world. I can give you the figures if you like, because they're very important. We can perhaps come back to them. So I think that's a key takeaway. And of course, consistent with that has been this, yes, it's a table, Dan, table 1.1. I won't go through all of it, but just to summarize, the key point was that whereas yes, that's right, you've got it. Whereas the global economy grew at about 1.9% on average, for the Asia Pacific economies, it was 4.7. So these are dry numbers that nerdy economists look at, but believe me, they make a big difference to living standards and the eradication of poverty over time. Let me mention one other takeaway, if I may, and that is the diversity within the Asia-Pacific region. And the volume divides the region, as we all do, into these major sub-regions: Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Within those regions, there is also a lot of diversity. In particular, Northeast Asia, driven particularly by China, has been the real standout. Its average growth has been 6.5%. Southeast Asia has done pretty well, 3.5, South Asia as well. The two lagging regions, if you like, within this vast region are really Central Asia, which of course are the countries part of the former Soviet Union, the 5 so-called stand countries, and the Pacific Islands, the islands off Australia and New Zealand. They have lagged quite a lot compared to the other parts of the region. So that would be my two takeaways. This
very good
extraordinary dynamism and also diversity within the region.
I'll come back to you, Hal. Thanks so much. Ambassador Dornsife, thanks for being here. What were your takeaways from this book? What are some of the lessons policymakers and others should take away from this book? Thanks for being here, Ambassador Dornsife.
Thank you as well. Nakao-san, thank you for that very detailed summary of such an important book with so many important points to make. And Dr. Hill, I appreciated all those nerdy statistics. I think that really places the Asian miracle and the remarkable prosperity that has resulted from all of those investments that Nakao-san so very ably summarized. It's not a miracle, as he said, it really is strong institutions and good policies. And so those are key takeaways. It's not surprising for anyone of us that has spent so much time in the region, but for those of you that are tuning in from the outside, this is something really to emphasize. I found the book really thorough. Dan, and one of the things that really struck me about this was that it is a companion piece to the history of the Asian Development Bank, which is a separate volume. And so this companion piece that takes a look at how did Asia get from where it was 50 years ago to where it is today, and all those various dimensions, modernizing of agriculture and rural development. If you think about it, in the 1960s, as the book says itself, about 2/3 of Asia was involved in agriculture, subsistence agriculture. And look at where we are now. And so the digital and other market transformations that have been made possible by all of the investments that you, Nakao-san, summarized so well, really have transformed this region. So, did you want me also to get into the key recommendations for policymakers? Okay, so what can Asia learn from the lessons that were drawn in this book? And indeed, policymakers in the United States, I was thinking about, our current administration, the Biden administration. The book recommends leading based on the Asian experience in exporting green products and services. This really jumped out at me, especially as we are in an era of climate change. This is the great catastrophic event that all of us must take immediate steps. And so I would say one of the key lessons is lead in exporting green products and services. Also, address the infrastructure gaps. So, President Biden has very robustly proposed investments in infrastructure. But in the book, what I was really struck by, Dan, is that it's not only investments in infrastructure, but there is specific type of infrastructure, namely environmentally friendly, low carbon, and climate resilient infrastructure. And so that was another really important lesson that struck me. Also, the investments in human capital development. One of the major chapters, Nakao-san, that you stressed was in education, health, and the demographic change. But to really stress the investment in human capital development, so much has been said about investments in STEM, science, technology, etc., engineering. And so this is, and mathematics, of course, this is very important. So those investments in human capital development. And also, I would just add a very important engine of growth that really struck me in all of the time on my Asian Development Bank board service, and indeed in all the years that I spent working in Asia and working now at Johns Hopkins on the faculty, is the investments in promoting access to capital for small and medium scale enterprises. Very important. So let me stop there, and I've got more to say at another
Thanks,
point.
Ambassador. Dr. Basri, I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. You're the former finance minister of Indonesia, but you also hosted an event, or you're familiar with this book. You've lived a lot of this book. I would welcome some of your takeaways from this book, and what are some of the lessons? Thank you, Dr. Basri, for being here.
First of all, I agree very much with what President Nakao said, not because he was my counterpart when I was a finance minister, but I think he specifically mentioned about the importance of the good economic policy. Let me talk from the perspective as a former policymakers. Yeah. President Nakao, in the previous conversation, he mentioned about the pragmatic approach. And this is very true. And I think this is very important because if you allow me to make a comparison with the previous report on the East Asian development in the book that East Asian Miracles, produced by the World Bank in the 90s, that book was pretty much emphasized about the importance of the role of the government intervention a little bit, showing that some countries like in East Asia. But I would say that perhaps one of the key recipe of the success for the Asian countries were industrialization, human capital, open trade, and the most important thing is a pragmatic approach. So then, if you allow me, let me speak a little bit about Indonesian experience. Yeah, in the 70s, we adopted the so-called the import substitution. Why did we adopt this kind of policy? Because we had an oil boom. We had money at the time. So the government could afford to introduce the various government intervention because we didn't really care about this economic efficiency. But in the 80s, the oil price collapsed. Then the government should do economic deregulation. So if you look at from the Indonesian experience, ideology here is more like an effect rather than a cause. So the policy was very pragmatic. You know, when the situation, economic situation, the world economy is changing, then we swing the pendulum from the state intervention into the market and the other way around. Yeah. The second thing is also about this, you know, the importance of this building of human capital. I think this is a very important. If you look at the case of East Asian, of like Korea, like Japan, like China, they are open for the foreign direct investment. They adopt the technology, and this is really the key that support the development of the the Asian countries and structural transformation. So looking from the economic perspective, I would agree pretty much with what President Nakao said. This is basically the recipe of the good economics, the good eco 101. Yeah. And I think this is something that very important, the lesson learned in the future, that if we stick in the, in the good eco 101, being pragmatic in the policy, we can always adjust our policy. That's why I would call that this book is probably one of the most important book about the history of the Asian development.
Thank you, Dr. Basri. I would like to ask you, Dr. Basri, Ambassador Dornsife, and Dr. Hill another question. I want the same question I asked President Nakao. In the book, he references that there's not an Asian consensus. I'd like each of you to react to the term Asian consensus. Let me start with you, Dr. Basri.
I agree very much, because if you look at on the so-called Washington consensus, what are the Washington consensus? Is like macro stability, discipline of fiscal, opening up the trade regime. That's exactly what the most Asian countries did. Yeah, including countries like in the Southeast Asia, for example. We opening up the trade regime. We got a benefit of the liberalization. So that is why then this is very interesting. I wrote a piece with Hal on this, to look at about the impact of this, the so-called the populism. Why the populist policy is less in terms of this, the impact to the people here in the country of Southeast Asia compared to Europe or the US, because Asian countries get the benefit of the globalization. So that is why the pressure, the pushback of globalization was relatively less. So I would say that probably, probably it's too strong to say that there is no such thing as an Asian consensus, but I would say that one of the key recipe why we Asian countries, been successful in developing that, because we also adopt a very similar policy, but being pragmatic in the area that we need the government intervention, then the government step in.
Thank you. Ambassador Dornsife, if I said Asian consensus, what's your reaction to that term?
I think you're going to be surprised that there is radical agreement on my side with my two previous colleagues who've already indicated their views about it. If there was one thing, so I agree that there's no such thing as an Asian consensus. Basri, you made very good points, about the pragmatic nature of the recommendations, just good sense, Econ 101, I think you called it, for policymakers in Asia to follow the good, sound economic policy that would, when implemented, bring about the kinds of structural stability and macroeconomic stability and the right factors to promote economic growth and sustainable economic growth. So it's, one thing, Dan, I would say is that during the Asian financial crisis, I had the privilege of serving on the board at the Asian Development Bank during that time. One thing that really struck me is that there is no one size fits all, apart from those Econ 101 principles that you, President Nakao, and you, Dr. Basri, have also emphasized. But honestly, there is a requirement that each individual's country's circumstances, the snapshot of where they are in history, whatever the global trends are that are impacting them all differently, commodity prices, the kinds of the trade and services, the kind of openness and trade regimes, it really varies over time. So to answer the question, I don't think there's such a thing as an Asian consensus. And my bottom line is that there is no one size fits all, except for good institutions and sound policies.
Excellent. Dr. Hill, is there an Asian consensus?
Well, I have to agree with Ambassador Cinnamon and Dr. Basri on the key points they've made. It is the case that there's diversity within the region, but there's also a lot of common elements. And the common elements in the success story have been already mentioned by my distinguished panelists and Nakao-san. It's countries deciding to go open, to be globally connected, countries which have prudent macroeconomic management, countries which ensure that living standards rise in a fairly broad-based manner, not just at the top, but across the board. So I think they're the key elements, but of course there's a lot of diversity. We may come back to it, but for example, as Nakao-san mentioned, you've got what you might call state-directed economies, most notably China, but other countries also which have had heavy government involvement, alongside much more market-oriented economies. So a lot of diversity within these common elements. Let me just mention also, I think there's been a virtuous circle within the region of countries following the success stories. And of course, the country which led Asian economic development after World War II was Japan, and the Japanese model was emulated, the four NIEs, newly industrialized new economies, and then it spread to Southeast Asia and of course to China. So there is this virtuous circle, which I think has been very important, countries learning from neighboring countries and then adopting some of the policies. Within the 10-nation ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, for example, the country which was really the most dynamic earlier was tiny Singapore. 5 million people in a population of 640 million people, but other countries learned from Singapore as well. So I think that virtuous circle story is actually a very important one as well.
Thank you. All right, I want to just take advantage of the panelists, and I'll bring President Nakao in after this, but I want to ask about democracy. So this book does not, that one of the elephants in the room in this book is I don't believe the word democracy is used. I've got my finger on the scale of democracy. Indonesia is a democracy. And obviously there's diversity in the 48 countries that are in the footprint of countries that are in the Asian Development Bank lending footprint. So let me start with you, Dr. Basri. Indonesia is a very successful democracy. It's been a democracy since the 1990s. Could you talk a little bit about the interplay between democracy and development in Asia, and how does that play into the success of development in Asia, please, President? Dr. Basri, please.
This is a very tough question. Then I would say that let me make a comparison with some countries in Southeast Asia. Yeah, for example, like Indonesia, Philippines, and also India. Those three countries, I call it is we have the similarities about vibrant democracy, and making a decision under the democratic situation is not always easy because you have to convince every stakeholders. The transaction cost is relatively high, making the process become very difficult. But one thing that I have to say that it creates somehow the political stability because people can channel, their view. Criticism is open in the media, and in the case for Indonesia, for example, we established the so-called the anti-corruption committee, which is very strong. Even they put some ministers, governor of central bank in jail. Which is create the confidence, which is really the big issue. A country like Indonesia, like Philippines, like India, for example. So this is just an example that probably we have to admit that with the democracy, there is a fragmentation of power. We can't really expect that there will be a strong growth immediately because we need to build the institution first. But if you're talking about the medium in the long term, I do believe that this democracy will support development. I can't hear you, Dan.
Sorry, my life is, this is my life, Dr. Basri. Sometimes I wish I had mute when I speak, and sometimes I speak when I am on mute. So it's one of the. But Dr. Basri, let me ask you this: are you hopeful for the future of democracy in Asia? Could you think that the arc of history bends towards democracy in Asia or in the future?
I do so because look at the experience of Indonesia. 1998, yeah, I recall Professor Hill was my supervisor at the Australian National University. We organized a discussion about Indonesia, the future of Indonesia, and by that time, all of us, agree that there is no future for Indonesia. Balkanization, bloodshed. If there is a direct presidential election, it was in '98 and 2008. I was accompanying President Yudhoyono in the G20 Leaders Forum. In 10 years, Indonesia, moved from zero to become hero. So this is also because there's, the reform of this political reform because of democracy.
Okay, so so you know where I'm going with this, Dr. Basri. So you could see countries that aren't currently democracies today someday be democracies in Asia, right?
Yeah, I think it is inevitable, like it or not.
We could just end the conversation right there. That's all I wanted to get out of this conversation. Great, Dr. Basri. That's fantastic. All right. So, but you can tell this is something I care a lot about. Ambassador Dornsife, democracy and development, the interplay, please.
Absolutely, Dan. When I think about this, I think about the principles of good governance. And so if you think about what comprises good governance, it's transparency, it's accountability, it's predictability, it's rule of law, it's participation and ownership. And so if you think about all of those elements, which by the way are principles in the multilateral development banks' own good governance policies, if you want to promote pro-poor sustainable economic growth, you must adhere to those principles. And so that principle of participation is very much a part of what comprises a democracy. So I would say that based on those principles that underlie the policies and the lending, and indeed the policy dialogue between the institutions and their borrowers, and indeed all shareholders, including the donors, including US, Japan, Australia, that these principles are very important to these institutions. And I would argue that in promoting the principles of good governance, it is moving in the direction that you are hoping to see.
Okay, so Ambassador, you're ambitious, sorry, you're optimistic that the arc of history bends towards democracy in Asia.
I am optimistic that the arc of history bends towards democracy in Asia. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be straightforward. There will be some steps ahead and some steps back. But yes, I think the arc of history is moving in that direction.
Yeah, let me just take advantage of this and just say, if I think about some Central Asian countries, so the government of Kazakhstan has made a commitment to join the OECD. Now, the OECD is the club of market democracies. So when I've met Kazakh officials, I say, you know what that means, right? You want to join this club? This is like joining this is like joining a very exclusive club of countries. You know what you're signing up for. And they say, oh, yeah. I mean, it's a very big deal. And then if you look at a country like Kyrgyzstan, which it's not very pretty, the democracy there, but there's something going on there. And I would also argue there's kind of something going on in that direction in Uzbekistan. Again, I'm not going to tell you, there's ferment. There's ferment. So anyway, so thank you, Ambassador.
Yes, maybe just let me add that one of the chapters in this book was about regional integration. And so learning from your neighbors and having that peer pressure. It's not outside pressure, it's friend to friend, neighbor to neighbor. That really, I think, is quite a profound factor of change. And I agree with President Nakao about the importance of ASEAN, for example.
I love it. Thank you, Ambassador Johnson. Okay, Hal Hill, the interplay of democracy and development. It's not necessarily mentioned in the book, but it's kind of the elephant in the room, if you will. So, Dr. Hill.
Well, I think you've summarized it very well, Dan. It is the elephant in the room. And it's not really the mandate, if I may say, it's not really the mandate of the Asian Development Bank to engage extensively in these political issues, since it has to be sensitive to its member countries. So a couple of points to make. First of all, standing back, there's really no clear relationship between economic development and democracy in Asia Pacific. That is, the star economy of the last 20 or 30 years, China, has not become more democratic. The assumption is that as countries get richer, they become more democratic. One hopes that assumption remains valid, but it's still work in progress. The earlier stages of really rapid economic development, we mentioned the four newly industrializing economies, none of them for quite long periods were at all democratic. They were top-down, ruthlessly development-oriented states in which democracy really was quite secondary. Then, of course, they became much more democratic, notably South Korea and Taiwan. So it's a very mixed picture, I think, within Southeast Asia. As Dr. Basri mentioned, Indonesia, I think, has been a remarkable case study of, 32 years of authoritarian government under President Suharto to this vibrant democracy since 1999. And of course, an important point to make, and this is one that Dr. Basri can really tell us all about, is the nature of economic development and economic policy making changes when you become democratic. When it's a top-down authoritarian state, in a sense, presidents and leaders can actually make policy quite quickly and implement it quite quickly. By the way, Dr. Basri mentioned his doctoral dissertation, a very fine piece of work. It was partly about that with reference to Suharto's Indonesia. When you become democratic, you've got to win the argument. You've got to bring constituencies with you, as Dr. Basri did when he was finance minister. So the nature of economic policy making changes. It becomes much more difficult to get reform, but once you get it, it's more likely to be durable. So I think we've got to think of these different variables when we're thinking about the relationship. One final point, if I may, even in authoritarian states, they are often responsive in the sense that they do deliver. There's a sort of compact between perhaps less political freedom, but rapid economic development and rising living standards. And also some of those states, while one-party states, for example, Vietnam, run by the Communist Party, has quite a lot of local level democracy, responsiveness, and social media. So we need a nuanced picture, and I hope we're heading on the road to democracy, but it's going to be a long road, I think.
All right, but let me pin you down, Dr. Hill. Do you believe the arc of history bends towards democracy in Asia, Dr. Hill?
Well, you certainly hope so. And, the next generation, these bright young kids, with the rise of social media, it's a hope. And I'm basically an optimistic person, so I think it's going to happen. But I think it's going to be a long time. Countries which are one-party states won't easily relinquish power. So we're in for the long haul.
I expect to see it. I'm going to stay healthy and walk 8 miles a day. So I'm gonna take a long view, but I expect to see it. So all right, let me shift gears. I got my democracy topic out of the way, which I'm very happy about. Okay, this book, again, I was told I've learned you need to repeat the title of a book several times in a session. So Asia's Journey to Prosperity, which is the Asian Development Bank book, Policy, Market, and Technology over 50 years. This book is in some ways, I'm not going to call it a response to the East Asian miracle in 1993 of the World Bank, but I wouldn't say it's a response, but maybe it's builds on the East Asian miracle book of 1993. And there's several things in this book that aren't necessarily covered in the 1993 East Asian miracle book. So there's some discussions about gender and the environment. There's significant discussions about this. President Nakao's talked about environment. Let's talk about environmental issues. Ambassador Dornsight's reflected on this. Let me start with you, Dr. Basri, about issues of the environment. Could you talk a little bit about how the sensitivity or environmental consciousness or issues of the environment, how you balance that with economic development? And President Nakao talked about, develop first, clean up later, which is so what's your reaction to that, Dr. Basri?
Well, I agree very much that one thing that's been missing in the discussion of the East Asian miracle was discussion about environment issues, gender. Let me talk a little bit about environment. My take on this is, I think we have the opportunity nowadays. Don't waste the crisis. Then we should do the so-called the green recovery after the COVID. And I can see this opportunity for this because the interest rate is relatively nowadays. So there is a chance for investing on this uh, environmental friendly sector. But if I may suggest, how could we improve the policy more into environmental friendly? I'm talking from the country perspective, like Indonesia or some ASEAN countries, like maybe like Cambodia or Vietnam. The problem with the environment is often perceived by many countries in Asia as a luxury goods. You can discuss about environment because you're already rich. So one way to solve this problem is how to link this issue with the day-to-day problem. Otherwise, you're not going to get the political support. So if we can, let's say, let me give an example about it. Yeah, I'm talking specifically about Indonesia. What is the top priority for a country like Indonesia? Is to get funding to address the issue of this providing funding for social protection, for health, and support the small medium enterprise because of the COVID. The question is, where does the money come from? One way to do it is to reduce the subsidy on the fossil fuel by introducing the excise on the fossil fuel. Then we can use this money for allocation on social protection, green recovery, etc. And if we use this narrative, people will see that we are not talking about this environmental friendly issue separately, but this is the thing that politically sound, economically sound, and implementable. So that is why the approach, the narrative is very important. Yeah, I can see the opportunities now because there is a need for many countries in Asia to get extra budgetary support. And let me give an example. Country like Indonesia, can you imagine the spending on the fossil fuel subsidy is even higher than spending on health? So we can do some relocation on this. And I think somehow this book provide a very important contribution by introducing this issue of environment, as President Nakao said. And in the future, I do believe that, we probably need to discuss in a more detail and more intense about this environmental policy.
Did I just say something, Dr. Basri? I am so struck by the caliber of technocratic excellence in Indonesia. I've known several finance ministers in your country. They're all phenomenal. Could you just for a minute explain to me why? I know that's a little bit of an awkward question, but Sri Mulyani, the woman who's now the managing director at the World Bank, who had your job, yourself, why is that?
This is a this is a tough question, but probably the answer. This is my speculation. Then, in our history, especially after Suharto, the position of finance minister and economic post were always given to the technocrat, people, at the university, and the president or the politician usually does not intervene on this position. So they let the technocrat to do. But one thing I have to say then, this is not always easy. Uh, I will quote what I call the Sadler's law. Bad times makes good policy and good times makes bad policy. The technocrat can only play a role during the crisis because by that time the politician will listen to them. But if you are in a good time, they don't need to listen to the technocrat. That is why I said, don't waste the crisis. Use this crisis as a as a venue to do an economic reform. Perhaps that's one of the explanation because they give this economic post to the technocrat.
I agree with all that, Dr. Brostri. Let me just take advantage of this conversation with you for a minute. I have a bias, and I have, perhaps it's not a fair bias. I would argue that many of the best technocrats in the world in many emerging economies were educated overseas. Sometimes they're educated in the United States. sometimes they're educated in Japan or Australia. Maybe that's not too fair, and maybe that reflects kind of my American bias, and that's something we tell ourselves in Washington. But could you just talk a minute about the benefit of many of the best technocrats in the world in emerging economies? Many of them have studied overseas. Does that contribute? Is that, we'd like to think it does, but maybe that's, we're giving ourselves too much credit.
Well, if I may say, Dan, I think the most important investment of the US on Indonesia and Australia is by investing in education, by providing a scholarship. Probably you heard about the story of the so-called the Berkeley Mafia. In the 50s, they provided scholarship, and then most of my seniors, they went to the UC Berkeley and then come back to Indonesia, become ministers. Similar to many students go to Australia, to many countries. So I think the best investment for a country like Indonesia and Asia is by providing a scholarship.
That makes me so happy. I also just want to reference, I know Japan does a lot of investment in long-term training.
Correct.
So I just want to recognize that as well. Thank you, Dr. Basri, for humoring me on this. I want to get to Ambassador Dornsife and Dr. Hill on the issue of environment. Then I'm going to come back to President Nakao in a minute, but I just want to get a couple more things out of my friends. And then I'm going to turn to you, President Nakao, because I know I want to bring you back into this. Ambassador Dornsife, environment and economic development. That was not in the East Asian Miracle. That is well covered in this book. You've been thinking about these issues for a long time. What's your reaction to that?
Very important topic. I would say this is the most important topic that we face. It is the catastrophic event, climate change, that if it is not addressed in a timely manner, and we are running out of time to address this, everything else really is so secondary. So I would say, to me, highlighting this important topic in this book was critical. And Nakao-san, I think you did a great job just pointing out all of those things that I've just summarized in my own words about why this is so important moving forward. And Dan, when I was talking about policy recommendations for policymakers that based on lessons learned in Asia drawn from this book, you'll notice that virtually all of those examples address infrastructure gaps. But I said invest in environmentally friendly, low carbon, and climate resilient infrastructure. And this is based on the recommendations in this book. So I would say there is no choice but to move forward on this.
Thank you. Hal Hill, environment, economic development and environment, the interplay between the two in Asia.
Thank you, Dan. So I do want to endorse the other panelists' remarks. I think they've made important points. I agree with them all. As someone mentioned, might have been Nakao-san at the beginning, the earlier strategy was grow first, clean up later. And you could see that in many countries over the course of their economic development, with initially very poor environmental amenities improving as incomes rise. Sometimes known as the environmental Kuznets curve, the inverted U shape. So I think that relationship now is breaking down, and it's breaking down because climate change is a global existential threat. I think you can walk a narrative both positive and extremely worrying, excuse me, in these scenarios. On the positive side, I think mentioned by Dr. Basri, now is an opportunity to actually invest when you've got globally very low interest rates, probably extending for several more years. So because the new investments embody the new technology, there's a lot of scope. Point one. Point two, technology itself is changing really rapidly. And in some ways, China illustrates that better than almost any other country. China, being the global factory, is producing things like solar panels and other environmental facilities very cheap, very quickly. So that's a positive story. Now, the worrying and the big challenge is how to get global cooperation on climate change, because there's a kind of free rider problem that countries wait for other countries to sort of start taking the initiative. But unless we have global cooperation now, hopefully with the Paris Accords and this year's Glasgow summit, we're not going to make much progress. A good example is deforestation. So the big tropical forests are in particularly Brazil, Indonesia, and Congo, they're still poor countries, Congo conflict-ridden. The rest of the world has an interest and a vital stake in these countries retaining a lot of their tropical forests, the lungs of the world. But the poor countries can reasonably say to the rich, well, you created this mess historically. It's really incumbent on you to actually help us to clean up. So we need that kind of global cooperation, which is going to be difficult to achieve. If I may make a political comment, I think the change of administration in the US is going to make that process a lot easier. But it's still
Dr.
going to be
Hill,
very.
I don't know what you're referring to, Dr. Hill. I don't know what you're referring to.
I'll leave it to your imagination, Dan. And so if you can get, of course, the other issue is another elephant in the room is US-China relations. You know, the two global superpowers have to cooperate on climate change. If they don't cooperate, along with EU, Japan, and then the major developing countries, India, Indonesia, we're not going to make progress. But it's really vital. I think this is, after COVID, this is the big global challenge.
Okay, very good.
Thanks.
President Nakao, let me bring you back into this conversation. You notice I didn't ask you this question. I purposely didn't want to put you on the spot about the issue of democracy. You can tell I care a lot about it. I'm on the board of IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, which runs free and fair elections. I've been on it for 6 years. I've done a lot of work on democracy. I support it. When I was in the Bush administration, I supported it. I really believed in President Bush's second inaugural address in 2005. It made a big impression on me. I really believe that stuff. So, okay, President Nakao, I'd like to ask you this issue of the intersection between democracy and development in Asia. I'd welcome your thoughts, President Nakao.
Thank you very much. I want to discuss that issue, but before that, I'd like to touch on the issues of environment and climate change. And our book has a very long and detailed stories of environment and climate change. And the environment includes air, soil, and water, and ocean, and forest, for instance. And there is a lot of interesting discussion which I didn't know. And invert Kuznets curve of environment, it is polluted and then recovered because of citizens' wish to have a clean water and air and so on. So, but the climate change is different because of externality, as Mr. Hill said. There can be a free rider. So we need to have a collective actions, and MDBs, including ADB, supporting it by financing it. And as once again, Mr. Hill said, it's advanced countries' obligation to support developing countries because the industrial countries of today polluted much. So that is my point. And ADB, one of three important priorities is climate, in addition to gender and poverty reduction. So that is my point. But about democracy or political system, it's a very interesting story, which I didn't cover much because ADB is supposed to be apolitical. But because this is a good opportunity for me, I'd like to mention it. And first, why did the countries take kind of a socialist or the import substitution? Because they became independent from the Western powers, mostly. Indonesia is from the Dutch, and also the Philippines from America, but more importantly, Vietnam and from France and so on, India from the UK. They want to be independent. They don't want to be continue to be exploited, and it is reinforced by the idea of a privilege, center, peripheral. If a country don't become industrialized, they will continue to be exploited. And that is, in a sense, misleading ideas, and it was not very successful. But there was such a kind of a political economy kind of the combination. So always a political system, a political idea is influencing economic policies. And we are now merging, but there is also difference. But
President Nakao, let me just push you on this issue of democracy. Do you believe that the arc of history in Asia bends towards democracy? Do you believe there will be more democracies in the future in Asia, President Nakao?
Yeah, that's right. So I think so. And one of the reasons is, of course, there are some countries which are more autocratic, or more, I mean, less democratic. But it is because in some Central Asian countries, there is always a threat from very extreme ideas coming from Afghanistan, for instance. So they must be prepared. And also, some countries, there are so many ethnicities. And if it's a democracy by the majorities, it means that the kind of a repression by the majorities on the minorities ethnicity. So democracy is not so automatically good, as we can see from
we've
Arab.
had a couple of bad moments in the United States recently.
That's right. And also Arab Spring, so it didn't come out with a very good result at this moment. So it's not perfect, but it's better than many other systems.
That's what Winston Churchill said.
That's right. And it is because although there is such ideas of wise monarchy or enlightened monarchy in the Greek and also in the ancient China, but it leads to the kind of the complacent ideas. They hear just what they want to hear. And there is a starting controlling the information instead of, hearing the views of public. They start controlling it. And also they become more populistic, and also it is becoming more corrupt in the end and rent seeking and so on. So it's, and also I would say the freedom of thoughts, freedom of speeches, these are the human rights. And we cannot give up these ideas. That's what Myanmar people are now trying to challenge, isn't it? That is our, I'm so against the idea that this is Western value. This is a human value. And this is not the Western value. And sometimes
Amen. I agree, President Nakao. Yes, I agree with you.
By the way, sometimes people misunderstand Japan's democracy started after the war, and it is not really true. Even after, Meiji restorations of 1868, people started requiring the parliament and the constitutional monarchy, and they looked at the France and so on. Some of them are more radical, but gradually they expanded voting powers. And in 1925, it was a male suffrage, all men, poor and so on, could vote. And that is one of the remote reasons of the war, because they became more populistic and the parties fought each other and criticizing the cut of the budget for Navy because of disarmament treaty. This is not fair. They fought each other, and in the end, they became very chauvinistic and populist. So democracy has been always there in Japanese system, and we don't misunderstand. Japan's democracy started after the war. So democracy was a background of a capitalistic approach, market approach of pre-war Japan. And so it should be interconnected. That's my point. So
President Nakao, I'm just cognizant of the time. We've only got 10 minutes left. I wanted to get everybody to answer one question from the audience, if I could.
Okay. So what I want to say is, although democracy is challenged, and we should make efforts of more equalities in advanced economies as well as in developing countries, and keep expertise of the experts like professors and think tanks and also bureaucrats. We need to make effort, but there is no other alternative in the end.
Thank you. I love, that's great. Okay. So here's one thing. One of the reasons I wanted to do this book event is I don't think this book got a fair hearing because it's sort of collateral damage from the COVID lockdown. That this book was published in January of 2020, just as COVID was starting, and there was a lockdown. And so I said to President, we have got to get this book out because it's unfair that this hasn't gotten as much coverage as I think it ought to because of the COVID lockdown. So we've gotten some questions from the audience that basically say there's been a lot of progress in the last 50 years, but COVID is threatening to set a lot of that back. Could you each comment on the impact of COVID, and what do we need to do? What do governments in Asia and MDBs like the Asian Development Bank need to do to respond to help economies emerge from COVID? So let me start with you, Dr. Basri.
I think this is a very important question, Dan. My biggest worry about this, the post-COVID is the so-called the K-shaped recovery, inequality, because the one that could survive from this pandemic may be someone who get the enough savings. Yeah, so there is a possibility of the rising inequality because of that. So the first one, I think it is very important for the policymakers, including the multilateral institution like the ADB, to emphasize on addressing the issue of inequality, like allocation of funding for health, education, gender gap, environmental issue. That's the first one. The second one, we learned from this pandemic as well. People who can survive, or companies who could survive from this pandemic, if they can transform themselves into digital, because there is no interaction physically. If you look at all over the world, even like what we are doing now is through digital. Yeah. So I will be imagine that the role of the digital become very important, and there will be an impact because there will be a disruption because of this. I call this situation is the accidental transformation. The technology is there, but will be expedited because this transformation will happen. So somehow we need to prepare what will be the future of work, what will be the implication of the unemployment, and also the role of the government. This is the thing that I'm concerned about, and I do believe that government, the multilateral, should look at how the government should position themselves. Can you imagine if the digital become very important? Every 1 year, every 6 months, every government regulation will be out of date because the product cycle is getting shorter and shorter. And of course, the perfect solution for this is you will have the agile bureaucracy. But then, agile bureaucracy is an oxymoron. There is no way that bureaucracy can be agile. So we have to change the mindset from agree on rules to agree on principle. So that is why the role of the government in the future will become, need to be reviewed again. Whether the government should step in or more give, opportunities for the people to do an innovation.
Great. Okay, Ambassador Dornsife, what do you think about this issue?
If you had called on me first, I would have said many of the same things as you, Dr. Basri. The number one concern for me in response to this global pandemic has been, especially in Asia, which is the focus of this really fine volume, is the setbacks in terms of progress that had been made in reducing poverty. And so that really is something very important to think about. But the rise in inequality, this is a huge, huge issue that I would also underscore. We've spent much time, Dan, talking already about environmental degradation, and that we cannot ignore this issue of climate change. This is our decade to take those actions. So the impact of COVID-19 has been dramatic. It has impacted people's lives, families, communities, countries. So many lives have been lost, and so much setback has impacted all the countries in Asia, indeed around the world. And so to just say that MDBs like the Asian Development Bank, multilateral development banks like the Asian Development Bank, have an important role to play going forward based on all of this history that they have, all of their experience, all of their expert staff and lessons learned, and books like this that point out where we have come from, what has made a difference, so that as we move forward, we can learn from all of those earlier successes. And yes, I agree, there is an important role for government.
Okay, Hal Hill, what's your reaction to this?
So, as you correctly said, Dan, the publication of this book was really overshadowed by COVID, and so it hasn't yet got the attention that it should be getting. It will get after we get through COVID. I think you mentioned that in the lockdown, this was your companion reading, Dan. It was mine also, although I read quite a bit of it earlier. The other book in the lockdown, which I really enjoyed, was a book called Radical Uncertainty by two eminent English authors, Kay and King. And in a way, the COVID is a perfect illustration of the notion of radical uncertainty. It is so difficult to predict, these exogenous one-off events. So a couple of points to make. First of all, I think the big development story is COVID has arrested this very encouraging trend pre-COVID of convergence, that is, of poorer countries catching up to the richer countries. And of course, that process driven mainly by Asia Pacific economy. So that's the first point. It is a setback for the global development. Second point, I think, as the other panelists have mentioned, it's highlighted this rich country, poor country divide. That is, rich countries have had the capacity to protect their citizens much more than poor countries. For example, they can afford to shut down and tell people not to leave their house because there's a social security network which can pay people to stay home. You don't have that facility, as Dr. Basri has mentioned in other forums, you don't have that option for poor countries. Secondly, rich countries have been able to run these really large, unprecedented fiscal stimulus measures because they can borrow. Poor countries have to be watching all the time. If they do expansionary fiscal policies, will they get hit by global capital markets? So the rich country, poor country divide is a real issue, I think. Another point just to emphasize is one curious feature of COVID has been there hasn't actually been a clear correlation between the countries the capacity to manage COVID between rich and poor countries. For example, if I may say, the US and the UK suffered very severely with the COVID pandemic. Some quite poor countries managed it pretty well. And a notable case in Southeast Asia is Vietnam. Vietnam had one of the best records of managing COVID. So it's a complicated, nuanced story. Final point to emphasize is phase one was COVID hitting countries and having to close down, take protective measures. Phase two, of course, is the vaccination story. And that's where we're going to see the action this year. And here again, I think there is a rich country, poor country issue. That is, the rich countries have the capacity to buy huge quantities of vaccines. Of course, they're also the producers of the vaccines. And the poor countries are really struggling. There is a vaccine nationalism, which I think is deeply concerning. And unless the rich world can collaborate with the poor world to address it, I think COVID's going to be around for much longer than it otherwise should be.
I 100% agree with it. Thank you. President Nakao, I'm going to give you the last word, please, of this conversation. President Nakao, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. About this COVID issues, equality is very important, and it's between countries and also within the society. One academician in Japan said the schools and offices are a good place to mix up different stratas of societies. They learn in the same class, and it in itself is inclusive. So remote work and remote education is not good for this. So equality is important. And also second, we should keep a multilateral system of trade and investment. Decoupling should be avoided as much as possible, and collective action by the society, international society is needed to fight this kind of a problem, as many people already mentioned. But the third, we also need strong sovereign governments. And in the end, we need to close the border. Border is still important, and we should care the pandemic in each state and also support countries affected. So strong government and capable government is important, although I don't agree again to the very authoritative government. We should have a democracy, and the approach should be based on the democracy. And finally, we cannot be complacent about the human achievement or Asian achievement. There are so many old remaining challenges and also new challenges like this. And in this history book, in the health part, there was already discussion that Asia is often the origin of many pandemic or infections. So we must be careful about it. We mentioned it, but it happened. So we cannot be complacent for anything, but especially we should be, Asia especially should be more strong in the soft powers. And the book approach is to make the voice of Asia heard, because there are so many discussions from American professor like Summers. He is always quoted, but how about the Asian voice? So I want to enhance the voice of Asia, which can contribute to the global thinking. So that is the end of my point.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to have to end it here. It's now 9:30 here in the United States. I want to thank all of you. Again, this is a very important book by the Asian Development Bank, Asia's Journey to Prosperity Policy Market and Technology over 50 Years. it covers this enormous, amazing story of amazing progress across Asia and the role that institutions like the Asian Development Bank played as a supporting actor in this incredible drama of Asia's development. Thank you all. Thank the panelists. Thank you, President Nakao. Thank you, my friend panelists. I hope to see you all in person sometime soon. Get vaccinated and let's come to Washington. We'll do this in person next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Very
Thank
enlightening
you.
panel.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Bye-bye.